Welcome to Military Analytics. The fighting in the Russia-Ukraine war is intensifying every day. The war has intensified in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. In the last few weeks, the most intense area is the city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. Russia was planning to advance from Bakhmut. However, the successful attacks of the Ukrainian army caused the Russians to fail in this region. The armed forces of Ukraine turned towards the town of Bakhmut with all its might. Azov troops and Chechen soldiers are fighting alongside the Ukrainian army in this region. The Azov troops are composed of soldiers with high combat experience. Chechens, on the other hand, have played an important role in the occupation, despite the refusal of the majority of Chechny's population to fight. Chechens on the Ukrainian side are fighting Chechens on Kadyrov's side. Kadyrov included Chechnya in the second month of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Most of Kadyrov Chechen factions surrendered to Ukrainian troops. The majority of Chechens continued to fight against Kadyrov on the Ukrainian side. Kadyrov, on the other hand, is on the side of Russia with dwindling troops. Let's take a look at the developments in the Russian-Ukrainian war. The war is currently intensifying in the Bakhmut region, thanks to the successful offensive of the Ukrainian army. Russia was forced to withdraw its troops from this region. Many areas in Bakhmut are under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russians are suffering heavy losses in Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army has recently achieved great success in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions. The army blockaded the occupied settlements. The Russian troops were cornered by this blockade. The Russian troops went on the defensive, but without success. Wagner Group, mercenaries, and Kadyrov's Chechen soldiers suffered the most damage in this area due to the shortage of military personnel. Russia's using mercenaries in most of the occupied territories. Mercenaries are used as cannon fodder in the war. Putin utilizes his mercenaries in the areas where the war is the fiercest. Mercenaries are aware of this situation and have problems with the Russian army. They do not listen to the commanders and harass the soldiers in the army. For all these reasons, Putin cannot succeed with mercenaries. According to Ukrainian officials, Russia lost thousands of soldiers in Bakhmut. Many targets in Donetsk, Luhansk and Kherson regions were destroyed as a result of successful strikes by the Ukrainian Air Force. Kadyrov's main base in the Luhansk region was hit by drones. This was one of Kadyrov's most important bases. Kadyrov lost hundreds of soldiers and thousands of ammunition as a result of the Ukrainian Air Force attack. Kadyrov also suffered a major loss in August. Hundreds of pro-Russian Chechen soldiers in the Donetsk region were killed in Ukrainian attacks. Kadyrov also suffered heavy losses in Donbass in September and October. Kadyrov was forced to withdraw his troops from many regions in the face of these attacks. Kadyrov had a headquarters in the south of Ukraine, but this headquarters is no more. The Ukrainian army blew up the headquarters in Zaporizhia. Ukraine's successful attack took place at around 10 a.m. the other day. Ukraine used artillery systems in this attack. As a result of the successful strikes, Kadyrov lost his most important base. According to reports from the region, a large number of Chechen soldiers were sleeping in the space. As a result of the bombing of the base, many soldiers reportedly burned to death. Local sources said that between 200 and 500 soldiers of Kadyrov's army were killed along with this base. Putin and Kadyrov, desperate against Ukraine, do not know what to do. Kadyrov is trying to keep his troops with lies. None of his statements can be verified. Kadyrov, who made statements with great conviction at the beginning of the occupation, can no longer show his old conviction. But Kadyrov has no choice but to support Putin because Putin offers Kadyrov money, office, and prosperity. It is claimed that Russian leader Putin called Kadyrov to the occupation with a special mission. Ukrainian intelligence officials made statements to confirm this claim. Intelligence officials announced that Kadyrov was given the task to occupy government buildings in Kiev. In addition, Kadyrov was also tasked to assassinate Ukrainian leader Zelensky. These statements were confirmed by Ukrainian intelligence. The Kremlin denied this claim. Russian leader Putin has been allocating huge resources to Kadyrov for years. For this reason, he seeks Kadyrov's support for the invasion. The relationship between Putin and Kadyrov is very important in this respect. If Kadyrov acts against Putin, he can lose his life with an order from Putin. If he supports Putin and the occupation, he can continue his life in prosperity. Kadyrov is seen as Putin's #1 man and the Kremlin's representative in Chechnya. For 20 years, Russia has poured millions of dollars into Kadyrov. For years, Kadyrov ran his army, which he built with his money. Kadyrov's opponents in Chechnya were suppressed with his army. Thanks to the continuous funding, Kadyrov has strengthened himself immensely. An international think tank based in Brussels reported that Putin had turned Kadyrov from zero into a hero. But he has also made him completely dependent on him. A former Kremlin official made striking claims. The former official said that Putin met even with Russian governors through aides, but not with Kadyrov directly. Many people are following the relationship between Kadyrov and Putin. Kremlin spokesman Peskov said that Putin was in constant talks with Kadyrov about the war. He stated that Chechen soldiers were on the front lines of the war. A new allegation has emerged these days. It was claimed that Kadyrov was competing with other mercenaries. It is stated that the Wagner group operating in the Russian troops and Chechen soldiers cannot get along and are in competition. The war is causing Russia to regress in every aspect. This disagreement in the Russian troops is straining Putin. The sanctions imposed by Western and European countries have also pushed Putin into a corner. Putin's meetings with the leaders of Belarus and China are interpreted as a request for help. The Russian army and people do not want to fight Russians. Soldiers in the army are surrendering to Ukraine every day. Anti-war protests within the country are increasing day by day. Although Putin tries to kill these protests with pressure, he cannot prevent them. Ukraine is making history with its successful attacks. Zelensky's unity with the Ukrainian army and people is appreciated by everyone. Certain European countries are supporting Ukraine with aid packages. US-made HIMARS and Turkish-made Bayraktars play a very important role in the aid packages. Thanks to this assistance, Ukraine is successfully destroying Russian bases, headquarters, and ammunition depots. The HIMARS missile system and Bayraktar drones are causing Russia to suffer huge losses. Faced with a shortage of military personnel and ammunition, Putin is losing ground day by day against these powerful weapons. How do you evaluate Putin's relationship with Kadyrov? How do you interpret the successful operation of the pro-Ukrainian Chechens? What do you think the war will look like in the new year? The most critical war of the century continues to capture Ukrainian lands. This war, which will occupy a high place in the history of world wars, has cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people so far. The world order was reshaped due to the Ukraine war. The security borders of Eastern Europe were redrawn, and global partnerships took a very different turn over time. So what is the latest situation on the battlefield right now? Where did the striking offensive operations of the Ukrainians to turn the tide of the war take place? And which side is currently leading the war? Let's discover the answers to all these questions together without wasting any time. First, let's look at the general situation of the front lines in the Ukrainian war. Our first stop is Bakhmut city of Donetsk region, one of the most critical front lines of Donbass, which became the center ground of attack operations in the Ukraine war. The Russians turned their focus on Ukraine's eastern front lines to expand the strategic zone north of Bakhmut. Because the Russians wanted to protect the region they are in against the big Ukrainian attack that is expected to start at any moment. Russian troops advanced along the highway and achieved considerable success here. But the losses incurred by the Russian army doubled as the Russians moved far away from their own air defense systems and advanced on a narrow front. Russian military casualties continued to hover around 1,000 people per day. On the other hand, the Russians noticed that the Ukrainian forces in Mankivka and nearby settlements began to increase. At the same time, it turned out that in the face of this situation, a third of all the forces of the Wagner group were brought to this 5-kilometer front line as soon as possible to create a defensive zone. According to the statements of the spokesperson of the Ukrainian Eastern armies, the violence of the clashes around Bakhmut increased even more. The Russian forces had a very difficult time advancing in and around Bereka, north of Bakhmut, because the Russians had a big hill in front of them around this region. Therefore, the Russians then focused on attacking a Ukrainian front near the Bakhmut highway, and the Russian troops, after breaking through the defenses there, were able to approach the Ukrainian positions on the hill by advancing through wooded terrain. This left the Ukrainian positions between Orikhovo and Vasilivka vulnerable. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians had to withdraw from 2 of the 4 checkpoints in this area as they came under crossfire. The main goal of the Russians here was to reach the city of Mankivka. This was a critical front line where the Ukrainians deployed their forces. The main purpose of these Russian attacks was to push the Ukrainians into a position war by attacking before they launched a counterattack and to prevent offensive actions. The most critical mission that the Wagner Group tried to fulfill in this region was to capture the ASM industrial area, the most fortified place in Bakhmut. Some sources say that Wagner entered the northern part of this industrial area, but the closest Russian rangers here are at least 800 meters away. According to GIO, proven images, the main purpose behind the attacks on these strong positions is quite critical. If Wagner's troops somehow manage to take over here, Bakhmut will fall very quickly, and it will be pointless for the Ukrainians to attempt a counterattack. But recently, Ukraine's 92nd Mechanized Brigade conducted a fierce offensive operation in the city of Bakhmut, which was heavily threatened by Russian and Wagner troops. Part of this powerful brigade from Ukraine expanded Ukraine's defense primarily by neutralizing more than 100 Russian soldiers in the ASM industrial area, which the Wagner Group wanted to seize. Soldiers of the 92nd Mechanized Brigade conducted a striking ambush operation against Russian troops at midnight, primarily at a factory in ASM. Russian troops thought they had surrounded the building where the 92nd Mechanized Brigade was located. But in areas with full frontal view of the building, soldiers from Ukraine's 92nd Mechanized Brigade killed hundreds of Russian soldiers with their sniper weapons and other rifles. The Russian troops, who were confused about what to do in the face of this situation, did not even have time to escape. After the turmoil, the soldiers of the 92nd Mechanized Brigade, scanning the Russian troops with machine guns, almost illuminated the darkness of the night. These Russian troops were completely ambushed and neutralized in the ASM industrial region, were hunted on the way to the hunt. Other Russian military groups in the industrial zone waiting for the attack had to retreat a little further from the industrial zone in order to act cautiously and change their deployment areas. After this striking ambush operation, in this way, the Ukrainian armed forces relieved their defensive positions much more and reduced the danger of the Russian and Wagner troops in the ASM industrial region to a certain extent. In addition, the cost of this striking ambush operation organized by Ukraine's 92nd Mechanized Brigade to the Russian army was very heavy. In addition to the loss of soldiers, the Russian army also suffered a great loss of prestige because it is known that not only the soldiers of the Russian army, but also the mercenaries of the Wagner Group are located in the ASM industrial zone in Bakhmut. In other words, the Ukrainian forces are fighting against 2 different military forces in this critical battlefield. And despite this, the Ukrainians inflict heavy losses on both the Russian troops and the mercenaries of the Wagner Group, inflicting heavy losses. In fact, Russian casualties have consistently skyrocketed ever since the Wagner Group launched their westward offensive, where they suffered heavy casualties. The Russians, who lost about 600 daily in the last week, have doubled that number over the last 3 days. Russian sources report that the advance of the Wagner Group was restrained by artillery, mortars, and aerial bombardment. Because the Wagner Group is currently advancing on a rather narrow line north of Bakhmut, and the Ukrainians are using the artillery units not only in Kostiantynivka but also in the Siversk against these Russian advance efforts. In addition, Ukrainian motor artillery constantly fire from safe positions behind Novomoskovsk. Advancing in such a narrow corridor also distanced the Russians from their own air defense systems. This made the Russians vulnerable to air attacks. It has been confirmed recently that the Ukrainian Air Force has bombed Russian positions freely, using up to 6 fighter jets. Today it was seen that 3 combat helicopters of the Ukrainian army flew at low altitudes and took part in the clashes in Bakhmut. Considering all this, it is hardly surprising that Russian casualties skyrocketed. Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, increased his efforts to recruit troops in Russia to replenish their ranks due to their losses. The Wagner Group initially opened recruitment centers in Russian sports clubs. In other words, the Wagner Group has recently started to focus on the Russian youth. The Wagner Group has recently opened 6 recruiting centers in schools. The Russian Ministry of Education has produced interesting career lessons about Wagner in many schools and encouraged to serve in the Wagner Group by telling stories of heroism. The Wagner Group probably wants to recruit them more. catching Russian youth and with these campaigns and brainwashed them with the radical ideology of Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin. Some Russian officials are also advertising the mercenaries of the Wagner Group in very strange places. For example, it was recently discovered that a psychiatrist in Moscow encouraged suicidal Russian men to join the army and die for a good cause. In summary, the Wagner forces wanted to prevent Ukrainian counteroffensive at all costs. In other words, the Wagner leader is aware that the gains they have made through the 7-month struggle are at stake, and Prigozhin tries to avoid defeat no matter how many losses they have suffered. Many analysts said that the Russians would attack in a very short time, but the Ukrainians still control the largest hills in the Bakhmut region. This does not allow Wagner troops to even clear Orahovo and its environs. For this reason, the Ukrainians should use the time they have to wait for the weather to improve and to plan counterattack operations. In addition, Western tanks and other military equipment to be sent to the Ukrainian army will be game changers of the Ukrainian armed forces. After a long wait for this reason, the time period between the date of military delivery to Ukraine and today is very important. Ukrainians must at least get through this critical time period with very light casualties. The Russians, on the other hand, want to launch an unexpected attack attempt before the planned military aid to the Ukrainian army. In fact, Moscow's approaches to this issue are quite logical, because if the military aid we mentioned reaches the Ukrainian army, the work of the Russian troops will become much more difficult. And if the Russians cannot do something to change the course of the war in this time period, Ukraine will come much closer to a decisive victory. The violence of the Ukraine war continues to increase. The collapse of the Russian army and many of its systems in Ukraine is increasing day by day. The Russian army was unable to carry out offensives from the ground, and the invading Russian soldiers were unable to get out of their trenches. To increase his long demotivated army's willingness to fight, put in place the Wagner mercenary group and soldiers of pro-Russian Chechen dictator Ramzan Kadyrov at the forefront of his army. But they also suffered from the successful offensives by the Ukrainian army. And both Wagner and Chechens suffered huge losses in the war. The fact that Chechens took sides with Putin in this war also led to the determination of the ranks of the Chechen separatists in the First and Second Circassian Wars. The transformation of a people fighting against Russia into a minority group now taking orders from Russia caused reactions from the Chechen people. Ramzan Kadyrov, who was brought to the presidency of Chechnya by Putin, took power so much that he declared those who opposed him or questioned his decision as traitors and infidels, and many Chechen dissidents had to flee their country. For these reasons, hundreds of Chechens who fled the violent rule of their Kremlin-backed leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, are now fighting alongside the Ukrainian army and seizing the chance to avenge family and friends lost in the wars against Moscow in their youth. The two main units on the Ukrainian side, the battalions of Sheikh Mansour and Zakhar Dudayev, gather several thousand soldiers between them, and some Chechens are also fighting in the Ukrainian army. The Chechen resistance had a streak that became more radical as time went on. Chechens know that they have a reputation for strictness and militancy, and they want to be at the forefront of this war. Umar, a special forces soldier from the Sheikh Mansour battalion, said the group has strict entry controls and weeds out extremists, criminals, and those with ties to undesirable groups. Umar says, "We are a pure battalion. We do not allow everyone to join us." The Sheikh Mansour battalion, on the other hand, was formed in 2014 at the start of the first phase of the war. Since last year, it has seen action around Kiev and then in Svyrodonetsk before moving to the Bakhmut front. The presence of Chechens on both sides of this war is an indication that Chechnya, despite being pacified, is still living with its own bitter conflict. It also highlights Putin's concerns that the defeat in Ukraine will lead to more separatist efforts in the Russian Federation. Young, inexperienced Ukrainian Chechen volunteers are at the forefront of the battle for Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. Given their combat record and knowledge of the enemy, our team came to the striking statements of two Chechen soldiers fighting with the Ukrainian army. The first of these soldiers, Isavedeno, took up arms against the Russians in 1994 and was wounded while fighting against the Russians in 2000. This brave Chechen soldier was still fearless as he fought Russian Wagner mercenaries on the front line last week in Irpin, just south of Bakhmut. In the intervening years, he lived in Azerbaijan and Poland, worked as an auto mechanic. The second of these soldiers fought the Russians until they were defeated in the Second Chechen War in Sabah, 2005. After years of training as a computer programmer in Austria and learning German, he now returned for the Ukrainian war and was recruited into the battalion of Sheikh Mansour, a contingent prominently Chechen but also Dagestan and other ethnic minorities from the Russian Federation. The brave Chechen soldier, Sarba, says, "We are used for special operations. Of course we have this guerrilla warfare experience so we can work anywhere," Issa says. "My two brothers died in the war. My father, mother, and sister died in the Russian bombardment." Chechen soldier Sarba told a similar story where his father, brother, and sister were killed by Russian forces. He and his brothers managed to escape. Sabah had a large family, but 70% of them were killed by the Russians. The Chechen revolt was finally suppressed when Kadyrov's late father Ahmad, an opposition leader, switched sides. He was killed, but his son Kadyrov took over. Since then, Ramzan Kadyrov has enforced his rule and President Putin's rule in Chechnya. During this critical period, most of the rebels fled to Europe. Some, like Issa and Sabah, lived in peace for years. Others followed Kadyrov and entered the Russian ranks. Many of them are now fighting with their own forces. For Moscow, on the other side of their former comrades, the numbers do not match evenly. Kadyrov sent the bulk of his personal army into Ukraine, with the estimated figure of more than 20,000 soldiers at one point fighting in Ukraine, and around 8 to 10,000 soldiers in the country at the height of their intervention in the early days of the occupation. A belief shared by Chechens fighting on the side of Ukraine is that if they defeat Putin in Ukraine, they will one day gain independence for their own republic. In addition to Chechnya, the autonomous republics crushed under Russia's oppressive system also oppose the Ukrainian invasion plan as a whole. But the Russians, as usual, seem to have found a way to build an empire of fear and put pressure on these countries after the full-scale invasion of Russian troops into Ukraine. The topic of the possible collapse of the Russian Federation into several independent states gained popularity in the Ukrainian and Western media. The degree of this speculation is increasing with the success of the Ukrainian armed forces at the front and the emerging problems in the Russian army. In the autumn, when the Ukrainian army successfully recaptured the territory of the Kharkiv Oblast from the Russians, General Ben Hodges compared the possible collapse of the Russian Federation with the collapse of the USSR, explaining that the world should prepare for the collapse of the Russian Federation at the beginning of the new year. Articles and comments were written on the topic of the disintegration of Russia. The main reporters of this issue in Ukraine are Alexei Danilov, Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, and Kyrylo Budanov, head of military intelligence, who occasionally raises questions about the collapse of the Russian Federation in his speeches and comments. A recent survey of 167 experts by the Atlantic Council showed that 40% of respondents expect Russia to collapse within the next 10 years due to revolution, civil war, political disintegration, or other reasons. The key issue in the process of the collapse of the Russian Federation is the strength and influence of national movements in modern Russia. That is, forces seeking to gain independence for their ethnic group or autonomous entity. In addition, legal, economic, and security factors, especially the support of Western democracies, have an impact on the disintegration aspirations of the Russian peoples. In terms of Imperial Moscow's policy, all leverage has been used to suppress such movements in the last few decades, as was in principle done centuries ago. Although the republics of Tatarstan, Dagestan, Chechnya, Ingushetia, Karelia, Yakutia, Bashkortostan, Chuvashia, and established national self-determination have their own constitutions like some of the subjects of the Russian Federation, this is not evidence of the free democratic development of national communities. We know from the history of Ukraine that in June 1917 the Central Rada of Ukraine declared the First Universal Declaration, and on November 3, independence on the formation of the Ukrainian People's Republic. The situation was similar in other parts of the old empire. In December 1917, the Republic of Tatarstan declared independence. From this period began the formation of the Turkish state of Idalural, which included the modern Chuvash Republic, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, and a number of nearby regions of the Orenburg, Chelyabinsk, and Samara oblasts. The Kuban People's Republic was established in February 1918, and the Siberian Republic in June. All these countries eventually ceased to exist under the pressure of the Red Army. The nations that succeeded in declaring and maintaining their independence were those that had strong national movements, a relatively new tradition of having their own state, and were also supported by officials from the US, UK, and France. The First World War also created a new world order. First, independence was successfully declared by Poles, Finns, Latvians, Estonians, and Lithuanians. Putin dreams of an empire, a large Russian empire, including former Soviet territories. These imperialist steps are dragging Putin to the bottom. Putin himself is aware that he will lose the Ukraine war and is still struggling to stay in his seat after this loss. While the small states that left the Soviet Union were nutritious fodder for the growing Russian beast, the beast that saw Ukraine as bait is now suffocating because Ukraine is caught in the throat of the beast. The peoples living in the Slavic lands clearly understood that no matter how powerful the beast is, it can be defeated in the end. The best example of this is given by Chechen soldiers who are currently fighting on the side of Ukraine.